Okay, good morning. We are on page 86 in the Hemshech Tafresh Sadik Daled 5694, which corresponds to sorry about that. Corresponds to Hemshech Ayin Beis, page 1149, 1150, where the discussion is about a third interpretation, the words of the Frierdiker Rebbe, Shita Shlishis, a third interpretation approach to the two levels of Ayin in that divine energy channel called Eir between creator and creation, Yesh Amiti and Yesh Nivra. So after explaining the first two, he said the focus here, the Kavona Khan, the intention here in this series of discourses is the third interpretation, which is all in the Eir HaMamala, in the immanent and internalized divine energy that permeates existence, as opposed to Sovev Kalaman, which transcends existence, and definitely the higher level, the first interpretation, where you're talking about everything before the Tzimtzum. So in Ayin Beis, we already learned, which we haven't yet reached in Sadik Daled, that the obvious interpretation of those two levels is the Kav, that since the Kav, which is that stream of energy, which essentially personifies Mamala Kalam, it's a thin, narrow flow that is transmitted post Tzimtzum, and it creates Ma'alomata, the structure, the hierarchy. So the higher level of the Kav, the one that touches Eir Ein Sof at the top, the one that where it originates from, that would be considered levels that are higher level of Ayin, of Yesh Amiti. That's what we said in Ayin Beis, and Sadik Daled, we'll get back to it later. I just wanted to put it in context. And this lower levels of the Kav, the Tachten, which is the lower level that does not touch Eir Ein Sof, which means its divine energy is diminished, that would be considered the Ayin of the Yesh Nivra. Both are divine energy, just a question of what it represents more the source or more the product, so to speak. Okay, and then he went on in Ayin Beis to say that by MS, in truth, it's deeper than that. That the two levels of Ayin is a Mamala Kalalman, the Etzem Ha'er of Mamala Kalalman, and the Spashtus of Mamala Kalalman. So I'm not going to go over right now because we learned this, and we're going to get back to it here at Tzadik. Tzadik Daled, meanwhile, is developing the early stages of this discussion by explaining what is the Kav. The Kav that creates Milo Mata. His father, the Rebbe Rashab, made that statement. It creates the structure of higher and lower. So we're discussing that, the Kav. And he began on page 84 saying that the Kav is the one that implements it. To use the example, the Kav is the stream of energy that, say, a teacher communicating to students. So that's very structured. Different students, different levels of expression. Or in the artist example that I've been giving, like a paintbrush, it regulates the flow from the hand of the artist, or let's put it the plan and vision of the artist, to the canvas of where you need regulation, because you just have a blotch of ink or paint. So you need to have different regulated colors and shapes and intensity and so on. So this is all the Kav's role. How does the Kav do it? He says it's Ayidei Tzimtzum. Through the Tzimtzum. It's because the Tzimtzum creates this chalkus, the space, that there should be levels in the first place. If you don't have a Tzimtzum, so the Eir Ein Sof, which is the indivisible field of divine energy, of divine consciousness, pre-Tzimtzum, there's no chalkus there. There's no structure altogether. Anything that is being envisioned by God is God's envisioning of it. But it's all still in the artist's mind or in the teacher's mind It's not yet an actionable flow, which is only post Tzimtzum. So therefore, the Tzimtzum is what creates this chalkus, meaning that the different levels of start being given its place. And I'll explain that in a moment a little bit more. And that allows for the kav to enter, the flow, which is a defined and a very defined structural flow. Okay. With that, the Frierdiker Rebbe goes now into explaining more about Milo Mato. So I want to add something I've not shared before, because I wanted to confirm, because I remember that these ideas were discussed in Ayin Beis earlier, and I finally found where they are. Actually, it's right under our nose because the Frierdiker Rebbe Rashab refers to it. And it makes more sense why the Frierdiker Rebbe is introducing it here. So the next piece where we learned the question, how does a structure come in the first place? When echad haposhut, there's a shapeless and seamless oneness. So how from that emerges a multitude and diversity, what he calls riboy and ischalkus from echad. And he cites the pardes. He says that answer is not sufficient. I'll sum that up in a few minutes. And then goes on to explain the real true answer. So all this, even though it was an addition that didn't seem to be an Ayin Beis where we're learning now on page 1149, 1150, but indeed it is Ayin Beis a little earlier. If you may recall on page 1150, the Rebbe Rashab refers to the Maimer Vayhi Ha'onon. When he starts talking about the structure created by the Kav, that it's not just that so he said that it's caused through the Tzimtzum, what he cites here, but here he doesn't, since he does not refer directly to Ayin Beis, what the Frierdiker Rebbe actually did, he went to that Maimer Vayhi Ha'onon, which is basically page 938 in volume 2. It's the same volume, but earlier, and actually quoted word for word from that Maimer. So when we were learning it, we were saying this is an addition of the Frierdiker. It is an addition. It's not written on page 1150, but it's written on page 938, where most of 938, most of this piece rather in Sadik Dal is from page 938 and 930 and through 939, 940 even, 938 through 940. So why am I saying it? It's not just a technicality, because the Frierdiker Rebbe Rashab does not have to repeat what he said. He just refers to what he says earlier in Ayin Beis. He says, look back there where I discussed how the Tzimtzum creates room, space for structure, for diversity. So, and there he brings the pardes and actually much more. If you go there, you get a lot more explanation on this whole subject matter. So I don't know if I'm going to go over all that he said there. I can refer you. We learned these classes back and then they're all recorded. But if you really want to have a bigger understanding of the pardes, the answer of the pardes, which I'm going to sum up now, the Frierdiker Rebbe only sums up. He doesn't quote the whole, almost half of a page that the Rebbe Rashab elaborates a lot more with the different shittas, whether it has in its shape and form or it's shapeless, etc. Okay, so this is one that I wanted to add. Now there are some additions the Frierdiker Rebbe adds, as he usually does, but the bulk of what we're learning on what we learned on page 84 and 85 about where does diversity come from and multitudes, Ribun and Schalkus come from, is taken from, as I said, the Maimer Vayhi Ha'onon. It's a Pesach Maimer, Ayin Hey. As I mentioned, the pages again, 938 through 940. Now, here's what he says there, and here's the context of it all. Being that he wants to explain what the Kav's function, and wants to explain ultimately the two levels of Ayin, which is the discussion here on page 1149, 1159 Beis. So what the Rebbe Rashab is doing, and the Frierdiker Rebbe is elaborating upon, is discussing, okay, what is the meaning of Ischalkus, the structure, and how did that come into being? So back then in the Maimer Vayhi Ha'onon that I'm referring to, that the Frierdiker Rebbe is citing here, in what we're learning in Sadik Daled, there the concern there, the interest, the issue there was he began there the question, how can a post-Tzimtzum reality experience a pre-Tzimtzum consciousness? That big question. Because it seems that everything, the existence is predicated on a Tzimtzum. Without a Tzimtzum, there could be no existence. So how could existence ever have an experience of pre-Tzimtzum when the whole pre-Tzimtzum would never allow existence to come into being? The ultimate answer, which is all part of what we're learning now, it's one big, long discussion, is transformation of the Tzimtzum. And the words he said in Ayin Beis was to understand how you transform the Tzimtzum, you have to understand the function of the Tzimtzum. Because initially it appears that Tzimtzum is concealment, that's it. So of course, if the divine energy is concealed, once you exist post-Tzimtzum, you can't ever pierce this concealment. That's the glass ceiling. You reach the Tzimtzum and that's it, that's your end of the road. However, when you start analyzing the personality of the Tzimtzum and its makeup and what its function is, then you realize it's much more complicated than that. The Tzimtzum is not just a block, an impediment. The Tzimtzum is part of the process of creation and revelation. But in order to create and in order for an existence to be independent, you need to first conceal before you reveal. So in this discussion, what the Tzimtzum accomplishes, he says two main things the Tzimtzum accomplishes. And that's what the Friedrich Rebbe quotes right here. If you look at 1 second. Just give me 1 second. Which says two things in the Tzimtzum. Oh, we didn't get to it yet, but we will get to it today when we learn. He quotes that two things that Tzimtzum accomplishes. One is it conceals the Er HaBligvul. Remember, the dominant reality, or the total reality, pre-Tzimtzum, is Elikuz B'Pshitus. Those are the words from Ayin Beis. The only reality is divine consciousness. That's all. Olamis are a complete novelty. When they will be created after the Tzimtzum, from the point of view of pre-Tzimtzum, they are a novelty and they're completely secondary. What dominates there is total Elikuz B'Pshitus. So the first thing that Tzimtzum does, it has to conceal that consciousness from the space, which is going to allow for, in the example, the student, in the moral, the nimshal, the existence to come to be. So that's the first thing it does. The second thing that Tzimtzum does, it makes sure that there's the b'midah v'gvul, the second which is the that will fit and be tailored to each part of existence, is manifests. So it's two different functions. As a result of that, one of the things he says in Ayin Beis, back in page, like I said, 938, he says that's how his chalkus comes into being. Because the Tzimtzum allows for structure to emerge. Even if God wants a structure, which he does, before the Tzimtzum, but it's all still in divine consciousness. That's not a structure. That structure is all submerged in the divine infinite It's only afterwards, when the comes into, after the Tzimtzum, that's when the can begin to, so whatever God envisioned, remember we talked about the Ratzon HaKodom and the Ratzon HaKloli and the Ratzon HaPrati and the Ratzon HaKodom, the three levels of first considering and then determining and then deliberating and determining, and then finally it coming into details and then envisioning and allocating resources. All that happens pre-Tzimtzum, but it doesn't manifest until after the Tzimtzum. So two things that Tzimtzum does. It conceals the infinite vast oneness of Elikuz B'Pshitus, conceals from post-Tzimtzum, doesn't conceal it on its own. It's still, that consciousness still remains, but there's room for another consciousness. And the second thing is a positive, that it creates the flow which will ultimately become the kav that will create the structure of, and therefore the hischalkus. That's what he says back on page 938. So I want to see the language there. Yeah. And then he says, to explain that, he goes into the pardes. The question, how does from unity come diversity? And exactly as we learned, the pardes answer is due to the kelim. The kelim do that. But that's not sufficient. And actually the language we learned that it's not sufficient, that's the lashon from Ayin Beis. There he doesn't say ein zeh tiritz maspik, he just says ein zeh maspik. It's not sufficient. Why? Because as we learned, the kelim and the eris down below, yes, you can see them as two separate entities. So the kelim create a color that the eir does not assume or acquire, whether it's, as he said, a white, red, or green tinted windows. Does not affect the light. It just affects the observer, the ayin hareya, the eye of the observer. That's the answer of the pardes. So he says that's fine down below, but you can't say that above because the eris and kelim are far more connected. And ultimately, the question just simply carries over: who created the kelim? The kelim, if the kelim create distinction and diversity, same issue. How does from oneness come diversity? So says the Rebbe Rashab, and the Frierdiker Rebbe cites it. Ach be'emes, he says pircha mikora lesser. What's the lashon exactly that he used? That was the language that he used. Yeah, he said that be'emes. He says these words: less pircha klal mikora. That actually is word for word from Ayin Beis, page 940. Says on top there, be'emes less pircha mikora klal. Why? Because at the root of the issue, it's all about atzmus. Atzmus is completely shapeless to the point you can't even define him by being shapeless. And therefore, just as oneness, he says, his complete state is fully capable, and machriach even, the possibility for creating diversity. And he cites in Ayin Beis the Avodas HaKodesh and the Maral. So it's all from Ayin Beis. Not taking away from the Frierdiker Rebbe, obviously, because he does add to it, but this is all quoting from an earlier Maimer and bringing it all together here. The relevance here, there in Ayin Beis, when he discussed it, it was relevant to explain the function of the tzimtzum. Here, he's discussing it in terms of the function of the kav and the tzimtzum, in context of coming back to explain that the kav creates his chalkus, and therefore, that would be the mamala of the ayin hayesh amiti, ayin of the yesh haniva. That's where this is leading to. Okay, so then the Frierdiker Rebbe continues in summing up what we learned so far, that this is all due to kol yachol. And what does kol yachol mean? Kol yachol means God is capable of everything because he's beyond everything. So you cannot limit him and say he can only create unity. Just as he can create gvul, just as he has the power of gvul, of creating the finite, he has the power of creating ribui and ischalkos, multitude, many, and diversity. And kol yachol, to the point, atzmus can't even be defined by kol yachol. That was what we learned at the bottom of page 85. It reflects on atzmus. It tells us about atzmus. It gives us some concept, what was the word I used? It gives us some concept, some taste of what Atzmus is like, but Atzmus is not defined by these words, not by Boira, not by Creator, even though that too teaches us something about Atzmus, and not by Kol Yachol. So just to sum up the last things we learned, and then we'll continue on. So then he goes on and says, I'm not going to go into now, but the Neshama, we discussed that already. Then he goes on to say, and this again is from, this is all from Ayin Beis, page 940, that Ein Sof, the Amitis Ein Sof is Bli Gvul Amiti, which means shlilas achiv and shlilas ashlila. You can't define and say it's not definable by saying it's not this, but you also can't say it's not this. In other words, it's not this. That's also not acceptable. Shlilas achiv would mean you can't define it in any particular way. You also can't negate it in any particular way. Shlilas agvul v'shlilas abligvul. That Atzmus is beyond the finite and beyond the infinite, and therefore he's everything. And in general, he says that Koyach HaBligvul is the Koyach HaAchdus, Koyach HaGvul is the Koyach HaRibui. So he's not this one and not that one, he's beyond them both. And in Atzmus, they all stand as one, and they're not even a paradox, they're not a contradiction, because there's no definition altogether there. So I'm just going to read from the bottom of page 85 so that we have the flow and continue from where we left. So he says like this. So Atzmus is neiseh shneim u'ba'atzmus hinei achdus v'aribus shezeh ha'bligvul v'agvul einam hofchim. In Atzmus, they're not opposites. Mipnei shakol hu Atzmus, because everything is Atzmus on that level. It's not about the Gvul or Bligvul, it's about Atzmus' capacity. And he's capable of everything equally. Now, the contrast is, when you're dealing with Giluyim, which means not Etzem, not Atzmus, the core essence, but the expression of the core essence. So there, infinite and finite are all not one of the same. It's two separate structures, two separate tracks. I'm on top of page 86 now. We read this, but I'm just going over it again. And the power of the finite is not at all the power of infinite, because you're dealing with a structured reality. Even the highest levels, it's already some form of definition. As soon as you're not talking about Atzmus, you already have definition, even if it's the highest level of definition. Etzem ha'ir, that we said is not even extending, but it's still ir. It's still defined by something. Atzmus is not definable, period. We have experiences that indicate on Atzmus, but Atzmus is not defined by those indicators. The infinite cannot receive and contain the Gvul. It's a separate entity. And the finite cannot be Makabel. Makabel means to receive, literally, to contain, to entertain even, to in any way engage with. It's completely two different things. In Atzmus, they're both Atzmus. This is word for word from page 940 in Ayin Beis. Okay, that's where we stopped. So it's not that Atzmus is a higher level where Gvul and Bligvul join. It's beyond Gvul and Bligvul. It's Atzmus, that's all it is. That's all it is. Atzmus is capable of anything. It's capable of Gvul, capable of Bligvul, capable of many other things we don't even know about. So it's all on an Atzmistic level. So it's not just a higher level, like you could say. In a lower level, you see two things. You go higher, they become one. No, they don't become one. They're altogether never were considered to be entities. The whole thing is Atzmus exercising whatever he wants to exercise. And expressing what he wants to express.
Bligvul is in our sagas. Atzmus, we don't know even what it is.
Correct. But he's going to say now something like this. So then I'm just going to elaborate a bit. So what is exactly the role of Bligvul? As we mentioned many times, why doesn't God just jump to Keich HaGvul or Ir HaGvul? He says, because the Bligvul Ir in Giluyim teaches us something. Listen to this. V'rak onu tevsim es ha'asmus yeser be'inyan ha'Bligvul. So Bligvul, even though Bligvul and Gvul are equal in Atzmus, and in Giluyim they're separate, but Bligvul, through Bligvul we grasp and we have a better, I guess, I don't say understanding, a better perception and concept of Atzmus. Why? Because Bligvul tells you it goes infinite everywhere. So that, in a sense, gives us a taste of the magnitude of Atzmus. That Atzmus is everything everywhere. Gvul is also obviously a force coming from Atzmus, but Gvul by definition means it's here and it's not there, it's limited. And that's what Atzmus wants. So we're not talking about the Kavanas Atzmus, but its personality doesn't quite capture Atzmus as much as Bligvul, not the personality of Atzmus, the expansion of Atzmus. Just like, for example, we'll say, Mokam ha'arden eina min hamida. The arden occupied space and the not occupied space. And what about the other parts of the Beis Hamikdash? They were not that way. The menorah was not that way. The mizbeach was not that way. The shulchan was not that way. Are they not expressions of the divine? You think they're not reflections of eloquence? Of course they are. But their function is a different one. Their function is to reveal whatever they have to reveal. The Malkam ha'arden eina min hamida came to reveal something that only Atzmus can do. Combine space and no space, just as an example. So he's not saying that Bligvul is closer to Atzmus than Gvul is. However, its personality reflects something about Atzmus that we can grasp, so-called the infinite scope or the infinite span of Atzmus's capacity. So it's like saying that a nes reveals for us something about Atzmus, that Elokus, that nature doesn't. But that doesn't mean nature is not as equal in Atzmus as a nes is. He's just saying the Bligvul gives us a tfisa, a grasp, a sense, some perception of something that is just endless. I'll just give you an example. I remember reading the famous physicist, Richard Feynman, Olav Shalom. He wrote that he was a believer in God until he began to study physics and he started seeing how large the universe is. You know, it's so large, he said to himself, a God that created the world by design would not create so much empty space. It would be like creating a living room that is billions and trillions of miles long. Who needs it? So if it was by plan, there's so much of the universe that human beings and the human race on Earth will never even access, won't even know it exists. Why would he create that? That's what he wrote. I never had the opportunity, but when I started learning Chassidus, ideas like we say here that from the Akedah Chassidus brings, that a nes reflects on God's infinite power. Teva reflects on God's finite power. Both are godly, equally godly, as we're learning here. Because what difference does it make in Atzmus? Bligvul is not a quality that Atzmus is spoiled from. Doesn't make Atzmus more excited. By us, infinite. Wow, infinite. If I lived infinite amount of years instead of finite, that's a big thing. By Atzmus, it's not a big thing. All these things are expressions, each with their own definition. Bligvul has its qualities, Gvul has its qualities. As a matter of fact, Keich HaGvul can actually have a certain qualities Keich HaBligvul doesn't have. We're not getting into that right now. So I remember reading that and I said to myself, no, that exactly is the answer to Feynman's question. God created a universe that's so expansive because he wanted to give us a taste of Bligvul. Not perfect Bligvul, but it's exactly that. It's not about efficiency. You want efficiency, look at the human body. Look at nature. There you see efficiency. You don't see one extra inch. Everything is perfectly compact, the brain and the mind and so on. But in the universe, Hashem also wanted to give us a taste of total expansiveness, Bligvul. That's why the universe is that way. That exactly is its purpose. It's not the functional side of it. In other words, efficiency. It's about giving a taste of something awesome. Then, just let me conclude my point. I was reading a sikha from the Rebbe. I think it's Yud Shvat Mem Gimel. I have to remember the dates. Twice, the Rebbe spoke about the redwood, the redwoods. those very tall trees in Northern California. They're so tall, if anyone's been there, you know what it is. Very, very, very tall trees. And some of them, they say, are thousands of years old. The Rebbe said, why don't you find such trees in Eretz Yisrael, in the other part of the world, the hemisphere where we Jews lived and people lived for so many years before we came to America? Why is it only in Northern California? And you know what the Rebbe answered? Very interesting answer. He says, the Alter Rebbe said that Matan Torah happened b'chatzi kadra elyon. Friedrich Rebbe explains in a letter to the Rebbe, that means Matan Torah happened in the entire universe. But Begoli, it happened in chatzi kadra elyon, in the hemisphere of Israel. That's why chatzi kadra tacht in America and so on doesn't have the same Gili Elikus. So the Rebbe said, this is the Rebbe's word. He said, because the Eibishter wanted to remind Chatzi Kadra Tachten of Elikus, because they have, in a certain way, they're more deficient in the Gilui of Matan Torah that was on the other Chatzi Kadra Elyon, he put trees like that, Dafka here, to remind us of Elikus that's beyond Hagbolas. Obviously, the trees are not Bli Gvul, but they're quite awesome when you see them. You see them, they're like completely not like any tree you've ever seen. That's what the Rebbe said. So in other words, there's sometimes things that are here to teach us about God's so-called efficiency and structure, and there are things that teach us about God's expansiveness and unlimited power. Just wanted to throw this into the discussion here. Obviously, this is not the theme of the Maimer. He's saying this as a qualification simply to tell us that even though Gvul and Bli Gvul are in Giluyim are different. But in Atzmus, there's no such thing as Gvul and Bli Gvul. The whole thing is Atzmus. Yeah. But in Giluyim, Gvul and Bli Gvul are two different tracks. The only thing is, Atzmus, the only thing is that Bli Gvul does give us something more. The word is Teif Simas Atzmus Yeser. Now, I want to just refer you back, if you remember, on page in Tzadik Daled, where he spoke the mile of Oyr and the mile of Yesh. Each one reveals another aspect of Atzmus. So he said the following. Let me just tell you where it is. We explained the Rambam. Yeah, page 39 and 40. There he explained how each one, Gvul and Bli Gvul in a way, not really Gvul and Bli Gvul there, there's more about Oyr and Yesh. So the Yesh reveals to us B'tzius Imatzmuse. And the Oyr reveals to us the awesomeness of the Bli Gvul. It's one of the things, besides other things that he spoke back on page 39 and 40. Okay.
Rabbi Jacobson,
Yeah.
two things, two questions. Where the Rebbe says on top of 86, Vagvul Eina Yechol L'Kabel Es Bli Gvul. But what about a line? In geometry, we say a limited line, the rule of this line, has a Bli Gvul number of Nakudas there. Isn't that an example of a Gvul containing or carrying Bli Gvul in it?
First of all, mathematical theories are just that. There's no such thing as an actual line in existence. You know, these are if you learn geometry, these are imaginary entities. Just like everything in this world is three-dimensional. So just to give us a sense of a point, a line, and a plane, that's number one. You're not going to find anywhere in this existence anything that's finite that contains infinite. So that's a mathematical concept. There's also a mathematical concept of the infinite set of numbers. So set of numbers are finite, and infinite set of numbers. These are theoretical ideas. So I wouldn't use mathematics. It's not a good question. If you showed me a table on Earth, or a tree, or a bird, or a human being that has infinite pieces, then you have a good question. But in mathematics, these are theoretical ideas. So they have the concept infinite. Second thing I would say is their infinity and the infinity we're talking about here are not exactly the same. There, it's an infinite concept of that it's not finite. I don't know if I would use Gvul and Bli Gvul. Mathematics is a limited study of Gvul and Bli Gvul. It's not, we're talking about true Ein Sof Amiti. Remember, before existence existed, there was no mathematics, and therefore there were no numbers, and there was no infinite and no finite. The power of Koyach Ein Sof to create Bli Gvul and the Koyach Ein Sof to create Gvul precedes anything of this structured universe. So he's talking here in the divine powers. That would be my main 2 points I would make.
Second question is, when you said that you see the divinity in the Bli Gvul more than the Gvul, but I know recently, I think, for example, there was this very famous person that was an atheist or something, a famous physicist or something, and he said he finally came to believe in God because of DNA. That in the finite, the most detailed DNA chromosomal structures, he said it's impossible when you look at the detail to not see God. So don't we say God is found in the details, even sometimes when we have...
Absolutely. That's exactly what I said. I just elaborated on that. That there's things you see godliness in detail and Gvul, and there's things you see godliness in Bli Gvul. That's not a contradiction. He's saying Tifsim Atzmus Yeser because Bli Gvul reflects the expansiveness of Atzmus. But then there's also the structure that reveals Atzmus. There's two separate entities. What he's speaking about here is that when I said expansiveness, like the expansive universe, the redwood trees, there are things that reflect Atzmus. That's element. If you want to get a sense of Atzmus's scope, of infinite scope, Bli Gvul grasps that more. If you want to other elements of the divine, that I didn't say that Bli Gvul captures more of the divine. It says Teifsim is Atzmus Yeser, being that Bli Gvul, because Bli Gvul captures that element of. In other words, if Atzmus was to reveal himself, what would be seemingly more reflective of Atzmus? Unlimited. Yet Atzmus also can express and reveal himself to the limited. It's not a contradiction.
Okay.
That's why we have miracles and we have nature. They both reveal plenty. And many ways, Koyach HaGvul can reveal even deeper elements. Okay. ורק אנו תספים את העצמוס יסר בעניין הבלי גבול. אבל באמס, but in truth, גם הגבול הוא עצמוס. But in truth, also gvul is atzmus. What he means that gvul is atzmus, not that gvul is atzmus, that atzmus has in it gvul equally to bli gvul. Or another way to say it, the shneim einam atzmus. Remember, shlila sachiv, shlila sashlila. So it's not like I said, you open up atzmus, you're going to find gvul and bli gvul. It's that God is not limited, and even in not limited by the word not limited, so he has both, everything. Mamelu hu hakel, like he said. Oi, the shneim einam atzmus. They're both not atzmus, because atzmus is not made of parts. The atzmus ein a gvul, the ein a bli gvul. Atzmus is not finite and not infinite. The shnei inyanim elu shaykh rak begiluyim. Their mere definition, their mere structure, their mere domain is only possible in giluyim. And giluyim, as I said, means manifestation. Atzmus doesn't manifest. It is what it is. Uba atzmus hu b'chinis hayechelis. And atzmus, so what do we say then? What are we saying? The koyachei b'gvul, he says, is the bechinas hayechelis. That's the word that the Alter Rebbe used, Tzemach Tzedek writes. For us to be able to have some sense, some handle, even yechelis, frankly, is not sufficient, but at least it's telling us it's his capacity. His capacity to radiate, and his capacity not to radiate, not to shine. So when we talk about Yechelis for a moment, capacity, what difference is there? It's one Yechelis, it's one Atzmus, who's Yecholtif in everything, capable of doing everything, anything he wants. Kol Yachol. And even that doesn't define him, as we said earlier. But so from that point of view, It's not like, oh, okay, wow, God created bli gvul. Great. Or he created something of gvul. All these things are all yechelis, and in that sense, they're both not atzmus, and they're both atzmus. That's why he said, oy de shneim, both are atzmus equally, or they're both not, because it's not about a definition. It's about, like he says, a yechelis, a capacity.
What do you mean that Shneim Einam Atzmus we understand? But to say that the Atzmus is Shneim, what does that mean? The Atzmus is a coil.
Read 3 lines from the previous page. He says, atzmus shenesa eshneim.
Noise is Shneim. Okay. But Shneim Einam Atzmus.
Right.
Noise is Yechoiles.
Yeah. But he does say on line 2, shneim hari ba'atzmus hari shneim hem atzmus. What he means by that is that not that they're atzmus, he means that both of them in atzmus are atzmizdik. They're not gvul and bli gvul. That's what he means.
Yeah.
Basically, bottom line, you can't say God does not have it. You can't say God does have it. You have to say he does not have it. So, B'mele he has both, and he's also not defined by both. That's what oy. The oy is coming to tell us that no matter what you do, you cannot limit it. So you could say God has, like he says, shneim hem atzmus. They're both atzmisdika powers, so to speak. That's how I would explain. Not that they define atzmus. Shneim hem atzmus doesn't mean they are atzmus. That atzmus is made up of gul and bli gvul. It means they're both on the atzmisdika level, whereas in Giluyim, there are 2 tracks. Gvul is not contained bli gvul. Bli gvul does not contain gvul. I want to add one more thing, by the way, to what Eliezer asked. I recall the Rebbe saying once, maybe even about mathematics, that maybe because Atzmus created gvul and bli gvul, he may give sometimes an example of a gvul that will have bli gvul elements, and maybe that's the line. So on its own, it doesn't make any sense. Finite and infinite never meet. But God is giving us a taste of his place where finite and infinite do meet. And perhaps some of that is why you could say, like if you would find the concept, in the mathematical concept, doesn't negate what I said earlier. I just wanted to add that into the equation. Okay. V'nizbar le'il, and it was discussed earlier, explained earlier, Ayin Beis kavim shkulim be'erein sof baruch hu. That these 2 kavim, lahoyer and loy lahoyer, to express and not express, or to shine and not shine. Remember, we said oyer, bicholte lahoyer, bicholte shalei lahoyer. Oyer is not muchrich. Even erein sof, the highest levels, there's nothing about them that is necessary. Once they exist, they have a certain. We spoke about qualitative inherent value, but they don't have to exist. Kodma heder we learned, meaning ki'ilu kodma heder. Only atzmus is the only mechuyev hametzias. So it's both kavim shkulim. Ubigiluyim zeu b'chinas keich habli gvul v'keich hagvul. Aha. In the world of Giluyim,
It means Atzmus here, right?
or etzema ed even. But pashtus he means here atzmus. But even erein sof, there's a level where l'mayla adin ketz l'mata is both kavim shkulim. He talked about this. Let me look on page. What page? I mentioned it before. 29, 27. 1 second. We spoke base kavim shkulim. Where was it? No, later. 1 second. On page 39 and 40, especially on top of 40, he said that. Let me just see. Sometimes it says the etzem ha'ir, it's also both kavim shkulim. They're both equal tracks. But here, clearly, he's really focusing on atzmus. The reason I think he says erein sof and not atzmus here is as soon as you say shavim, you're already talking about base kavim. So there's levels here. In other words, there's a level where they're shavim. There's a level in atzmus, they're mechal not shavim. They're altogether not existent. And then there's two kavim that are not shavim, gvul and bli gvul. But I think he's not loynach. He's not. For all practical purposes, he's talking about giluyim and atzmus. So, ubigiluyim, what are these two? What is lahoyer? That's koyach bli gvul, and shaloi lahoyer is koyach gvul. Sometimes it says the opposite, actually. So now, interestingly, if I may, before he said the koyach bli gvul is koyach achdus, koyach gvul is koyach haribui. Now he says lahoyer and shaloi lahoyer. From the order, it seems to be that lahoyer would be koyach bli gvul, and shaloi lahoyer is koyach gvul. Sometimes it says the opposite, just for the record. I think on page, what I just referred to, what page did I just refer to? 30? Yeah, 1 second. Let me just see something. Anyway, it's not so relevant to the discussion. Bottom line is that there's a place where there's two levels and structured, and there's a place where there's no two levels altogether equal. Remember this, that as we talked about the interface, since we want to have an experience of all levels, even the highest levels, that's why in Eid itself, as you go lifnei at Tzimtzum, you'll see the levels don't become levels anymore. They are two, in the divine consciousness, two concepts, if you wish. When you go even deeper, they become one, shnei kavim shkulim. And when you go into atzmus, all definitions fall apart, fall away. But you can't really appreciate atzmus unless you appreciate the levels. That's why it's important to know there's all these different levels. After the tzimtzum, all this will take real definition and real shape and form. Before the tzimtzum, it's only definitions within the Eid Ein Sof, as God is so-called beginning to create definitions. But it's not an actual structure. So it's interesting. So just to put it into Aveda de Ke'esius, when you do a mitzvah has shiurim. Every mitzvah has a shiur. When you're supposed to do it, how much you're supposed to do, what's the limit. That's what a midah of a shiur is. You know, whether it's a shiur of kazayas or it's a shiur of zman that you're supposed to, there's a shachris is a certain zman krishma or other zmanim. These are all defined and there's no games. You can't say since atzmus is everywhere and all the time and lamaylam is man, and we just learned beyond gvul and beyond bli gvul. So what difference does it make if I say Krishma 9 o'clock in the morning or 9 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock in the morning? And yet halacha is very precise. Rahman al-Islan, someone is Mechal Shabbos, it's only the moment that Shabbos begins and ends. Not a moment later, not a moment earlier. So there's real structure. No one can say this is an imaginary structure or it's only in our eyes. It's a real defined Teiristic structure. Yes, we learn in Chassidus that when you do a mitzvah bizman and mokim, it touches a place that's beyond zman and mokim. But you still have to do it in your zman and mokim. You cannot make that decision. You can't keep Shabbos on Friday or Thursday, no matter what you want. I'm not talking about the halach if you don't know what day is Shabbos. So then the Torah gives us to count 7 days. I'm not discussing that right now. So mitzvahs have parameters. No mitzvah, every mitzvah has parameters. There are mitzvahs that don't have parameters. That mitzvah she'ein hazman grama. It's not bound to time. Fine, avos Hashem, yiras Hashem, amunah. But that itself is its parameter. It's not bound by time. My point is that structure is not just vital to existence. That the heart and the mind and the liver and your arms and legs are a structure. And they're not just all bli gvul, one big unity. There's a structure, they work in harmony. Because that's what Eibishter wanted. He wanted a world of structure, a world of gvul and midah, riboy and ischalkus. And look at the diversity of existence. Mo rabu masech Hashem, mo gadlu masech Hashem. The Torah says, mo rabu, a multitude. That's not an illusion. And it's semeach, and a daimim is not semeach, and semeach is not chai, and chai is not medaber. Yes, there's an interface between them, and they interact, and we all have iskalulus. The Adam, the medaber has chai in him, and semeach, and daimim, etc. But at the end of the day, existence is defined by structure. Yet, what means making a dira b'tachtenim? That in this structure of riba and ischalkus, we are charged with a mission to bring achdus, to reveal achdus Hashem in the multitude, in the world of diversity and even fragmented universe, is to reveal the godly unity in everything. And there's levels in that as well. In essence, ultimately, the kavanah is to bring together the bligvul and the gvul, together with that, to reveal, first of all, the godliness in the gvul. Everything is godly. But also the bligvul within the gvul, that everything also reflects the highest levels. So the point I'm making here is that when you go down below, there's real structures. There's gvul, there's bligvul, in gvul itself, all the different levels. Generally said, bligvul reflects achdus, because it's talking about the oneness that essentially unites everything. Like the bligvul before the tzimtzum. It's a divine, a seamless consciousness. Gvul, he said, reflects diversity. Remember, diversity is not a bad thing. It's the way God created us. We should be diverse. We're different people, different personalities. And ultimately, you have to work with the gvul according to the halachas, and says, this is when you eat. This is how much matzah you're supposed to eat. This is when you do it, what you do, all the shiurim, all the details. You reveal as much as you can the godliness in the details. From that, you grow and start seeing, one second, there's something that unites them all, a transcendence, a bligvul, a shek rotzen Hashem. Everything is God's will. In will itself, we've learned a bunch of levels. And ultimately, what you're doing is climbing the ladder from a structured existence, aligning that with godliness, then connecting it to the more unified forces that are more bligvul. Ultimately, you want to come to a point where everything becomes so seamless and one that it's basically everything is an expression of atzmus. And an atzmus, obviously, it's neither structure, neither non-structure. But those words don't make sense to us because we're structured entities. So the only way we can get there is by working with our structures, which are also created by God. Remember, the gvul of existence and the bligvul of existence is created by the same atzmus. And in atzmus, actually, they're not even two different things. They're God's yechelis. I just wanted to put it a little in the context of that. So when a person does a mitzvah, with all the definitions, you're not just doing definitions, not because we're limited people, it's because God said, Samtzim atzmei ben shnei badei oren, it says. God, so-called, contracted himself between the two rods on the oren. What does that mean? Because God is not containable. Shlomo HaMelech said to Hashem, while building the Beis HaMikdash, Shemayim v'shmei ha-shemayim lo yichalkelucha. The heavens and the heaven of heavens can't contain you. Afke abayis hazeh, this little house, this defined structure on earth is going to contain you? And the Eibishter said, B'nechus, yes, exactly right. Because I'm not bound by bligvul. What do you think? The only thing that can contain me is bligvul? No. I have chosen to be v'shachanti b'seicham in this gvul. And in the gvul, you'll find me, and you'll find bligvul, and you'll find ultimately levels that are beyond gvul and bligvul. Now, where each of us stands, it depends on our avodah. Even though it's a very intriguing concept, gvul and bligvul together, but let's be honest, it's really more in our minds. We like the idea. It's an interesting theory. But practically speaking, how much do we relate to it? So it all comes down. There are parts of our avodah that are very gvul oriented, perfectly fine. B'chol levavcha. Then we have b'chol nafshecha. Then we have b'chol meidecha. We start tasting something that's beyond us. When a person is shinei haragilis, like he says in Tanya, chapter Perek Tezvav, chapter 15. When you go out of your routine, you're introducing bligvul into your life. Even though it's ma'oid cha, the Chassidus says, because you shifted beyond your comfort zone and your routine and pattern, you bring ma'oid amiti. Because it's relative to you. Your shift outside of your gvul, meaning your usual pattern, brings bligvul into your life. Now, is it bligvul hamiti, ultimate bligvul? Obviously, your bligvul compared to someone else can be gvul, but that's part of the journey. So the point is, all the pieces of the puzzle are meant to create a full, eloquent picture of gvul, bligvul, and beyond gvul and bligvul in general terms. And that's really what all this is really leading to. Obviously, we're going to get to the Yeshamiti, Yeshaniva, the Ayin, because what's the Ayin? At the end of the day, the Ayin is an interface for us to travel with, to use. The interface that the Ayin Anivra, the Ayin of the Yeshanivra is one that is a lakuz that we can relate to. The Ayin of the Yeshamiti is the lakuz that's beyond us at this point. So it's like almost like, as we're going to learn, it's almost like the bligvul in the kav and the gvul in the kav. Even though the kav is fundamentally gvul, but it touches Eid Ein Sof, as we're going to soon learn. So I just wanted to put a little context here, because it's not just, you can get so trapped. I don't say trapped. You can get so stuck in trying to figure out this gvul and bligvul. You have to also bring it into like what are the implications? Chassidus applied implications to our lives from all of this. Okay. So base kavim shkulim be'erin sof baruch hu, good. U'begiluyim zeh b'chinas keich habligvul keich hagvul. That's where we stopped. Okay, let's continue. Anybody want to ask anything, or I think? So he says now like this: the koydem at tzimtzum hoyizgalus mebchinas keich habligvul shebe'ein sof. Now he's bringing it back to explain what the function of the tzimtzum and the kav is in understanding his chalkus. In other words, the structure of existence. So he says like this. Before the tzimtzum, which means, of course, conceptually, the level's higher than tzimtzum, there was a revelation of kayach habligvul, shebe ein sof. What means kayach habligvul? There was no definitions or structures. It was the full expansiveness of divine consciousness. Bottom line is, as I explained a number of times, Atzmus, once emerges from Atzmus, what is a bligvul, a field of energy, an unlimited field of energy. Within that field, we'll begin developing the stages that we discussed. Still pre-tzimtzum, it's all within God's consciousness. But it's essentially a bligvul. So of course the question, I mentioned it, but I'll say it again. Why did God why did he jump right away to gvul? Since gvul and bligvul are equal to him, because we would never have a taste of God's bligvul if he jumped straight to gvul. We only know Atzmus, of course Atzmus is capable of everything. So we want to have something that is awesome, that reflects on the grandeur, the wonder. Remember the haflah Ein Sof. And there's different aspects to that haflah. There's the so-called personality, quote unquote, of Atzmus, like the Chuy v'Metzias, Mitziusim Atzmusei, built the Metzias Nimtza. But then there's the sheer infinite power of Atzmus. I mean, when you stand in awe of a natural beauty, a natural wonder, what are we getting? It's an experience of Marabu Masech Hashem or Magadlu Masech Hashem. It evokes awe. Why? Because it evokes awe by its sheer infinite power. At the same time, as I said before, that does not mean, of course you go into the details, you said the DNA. Any system, study the human body. It's mind-boggling how everything works when something is healthy. It's like you say, who's doing this? No machine, no engineer can replicate. Look, a camera. A camera was replicating the human eye. I once went to research it a bit. With all its replication, you know how many parts of the human eye a camera cannot replicate? With all our advancements today. Because at the end of the day, it's a machine, it's a man-made machine. They studied the human eye, and we learned shutters and shades and colors, and a lot can be captured. but there's still something that a human eye sees that a camera will never be able to see. You know, and even a great camera, it's still going to be a still photo. So as much as you look at a photo of someone you love, when you see them with your own eyes, there's something about it. And that's why Aliyah L'Regel is not just seeing a picture of Yerushalayim, you have to actually go there and see it. My point I'm making here is just the wonder of the engineering of details, of the most minute details. So it's all, remember, we learn it's all meant to give us a taste of godliness. Why did God not just create one beautiful thing? Because every part of existence reflects another part of divine magic. And all together, we start getting a picture. We say, wow, awesome. Some things will be through Gvul, some will be through Bli Gvul. Okay, so before the Tzimtzum were dominated, doesn't even use the word dominate. His galus bechinas keach ha-Bli Gvul. Shebe Ein Sof. Basically, Achdus, as he said, Oyer, in the words of Eitz Chaim, Amala Kol HaMetzias, there's nothing but divine consciousness. Elikuz b'pshitus. In that type of environment, tell me, is there room for another entity? Is there room for free will? Is there room for any of us to come suddenly emerge and do anything? There's no room for anything. It's the brilliance of the teacher, expanded everywhere, indivisible, omnipotent, and that's that. That's the presence, Lifnei Tzimtzum. That's Lifnei Tzimtzum reality, or consciousness. L'chein, that's why. And again, logical. God could do whatever he wants. We're talking now a process. L'chein hine alidei Tzimtzum bo'er b'bchinas ischalkus. So there's no ischalkus in Eir HaBli Gvul, and that's even God envisioning ischalkus. Remember, it's not ischalkus. That's God's envisioning how he wants the structure to be built. So the Tzimtzum, which conceals, that caused the Eir to come into distinction, meaning capacity for distinction. Remember, without the Kav, the Tzimtzum just creates the possibility, because the Tzimtzum is not Eir. The Tzimtzum is concealment. That Tzimtzum hu bebeis inyanim. This is what I referred to earlier, and this is from page 934 in Ayin Beis. So again, if you really want to get a better picture of this, beyond what I'm explaining, go back to page 934 on this, where he talks about the two functions of the Tzimtzum. The Tzimtzum was in two things. Ha'alaf, siluk ha'er ein sof ha-Bli Gvul. Siluk literally means to remove. Tzimtzum b'derech siluk. But we know that's not Tzimtzum kipshute, it's not literal siluk. It really means utter concealment. That's why it's called siluk, because it's as if it doesn't exist. Miyut would mean it's diminished. You like dim the lights. You dim the light. Siluk means utter darkness from the perspective of the recipient, not the perspective of the teacher. So that's called, the first thing is siluk ha-Bli Gvul. Why? Because as long as the Bli Gvul, the infinite expansion, or the teacher who just completely consumed fully with the brilliance of his ideas, there's no, if you don't have a Tzimtzum in that, there's just no room for anyone else, period. So that's function number one. For Beis, the second element that Tzimtzum accomplishes is Tzimtzum v'Helam ha'er, is the contraction or the and v'Helam and concealment of the light, sheba b'midah v'gvul. The light that will come, you could touch it two ways. It's the Tzimtzum the Eir that it should come b'midah v'gvul with measure and parameter, or the Tzimtzum element in the Eir midah v'gvul that was concealed before the Tzimtzum. I'm not sure which one he's going to say here. If I recall correctly, probably both. But let's just read on. What does that mean? V'kavona b'zeh. So well, let me put it more practically. The teacher, first thing he has to do, he has to conceal his brilliance. If he's going to be completely immersed in his learning, on his level, and we're talking about, obviously, it's a human being, so it's not really infinity. It's just an example. But if he's completely consumed with the depth of his learning, and he's not in any way diminishing that, and he's not stopping, what's going to happen? A student, let's say, walks in. There's no room for the student. The student will just be mavalbel him. He'll just confuse the teacher. The teacher will not look at him. I'm just talking technically. Obviously, lifting at symptom, there's no student to talk of. But you get the idea. So, something has to be done with this. If you want to move forward into a relationship with another, in the case of a teacher and a student with a student, you can't leave the Eira Sub Bligvul just unlimited. So the teacher has to quiet himself, has to either stop learning or stop focusing or stop and say, okay, time has come for me to receive few students. But that's only the first effect. That just quiets down the Bligvul. What do you do now? You still need a flow of Gvul. That's not enough. The students can come in now and at least they're present, but he still needs to teach them. So the second thing that Tzimtzum does is regulate the Eir of Midah Gvul to both emerge and to flow properly. So the Tzimtzum is like the regulator in a sense, but still a concealed regulator. The Kav is going to be the actual flow of consciousness. The Tzimtzum is essentially creating the space and the right structure for this to manifest. Okay, so he says, so therefore this means that the intention in this is that the extension of energy that comes after the tzimtzum, hu ba b'derech dilug, ha-tzimtzum. It comes with a leap of the tzimtzum, v'hainu shalei b'hadraga, which means not in a gradual, in a what's the word, incremental way. Not in any step-by-step way. He's going to explain this now at length, what that means. Again, all this is now page 940 in Ayin Beis. So even though it's not what we're learning now in Ayin Beis, 1149, but in 940, that's where he discusses this. Okay. Okay. So that's the word. Let's repeat the words. Dilug. Derech dilug would mean a leap. And shalei b'adragu means not in a structural, incremental, step-by-step process. And he's going to give a very interesting mashal, which is straight from Ayin Beis, that will help us understand this. Remember, I've used the words quantum leap. I've used the word radical shift. These are all what the tzimtzum does. Remember, because you're dealing with elikus b'pshitus, which is a completely different way of looking at existence. Existence is a novelty. All that's real is God. Elam is bischatshus. You can't just diminish it. Elikus b'pshitus is a qualitative, different form of consciousness. The story I told about the chassid and non-chassid. I think about God all day because I know I exist. So my question is whether God exists. This is the natural process from below. The chassid said, I think about myself all day because I know God exists. That's a given. The question is, do I exist? And if I exist, why do I exist? And how do I know I exist? And what's my purpose? This isn't a shift this isn't like two different sentences, phrases. It's a different attitude. One comes with the assumption is, Eined Movade, period. There's nothing but God. Now I have to figure out, so why do I see a world? Why do I see existence? I remember it was Vayikra Tavshimem Gimel. That was speaking about children. And he said, if you want to know what Elikus B'Pshitis is like, you ask a child. You ask a child, how do you know there's a world? How do you know the world exists? So you ask an adult will laugh. What do you mean, how do I know the world exists? My whole life is around this world. I need to make money. This one insulted me. I have this interest. I have this ego, that ego. Everybody, no, I was going to say, everyone will laugh if you ask them, how do you know the world exists? For a child, it's the opposite. How do you know the world exists? And the Rebbe pointed to a child standing right in front of me. It happened to be my brother. The Rebbe pointed and said, "V'vana veist asada welt." And the Rebbe didn't wait for an answer. He was busy with something else anyway. And the Rebbe said, "V'vana veisted, was steht Bereshis bara Elokim, v'shamayim v'sa'aretz." It says God created heaven and earth. That's why we know there's a Welt. Chassidus brings another reason, another proof from Achizis Anayim. It's not relevant to our discussion. My point is, because by a child, what do you mean? Who says the world? Maybe it's an illusion. That's a whole different way of thinking. So when you're lifnei at tzimtzum, you're not thinking that a world exists and now I'm going to figure out where God fits in. It's the other way around. Only God exists, and you can't even see space for anything else. So how do you get from such consciousness to our consciousness where we think we're the center of the universe? And at best, we believe in God. We understand God exists. We extrapolate, ein davar eisa es atzmei, nothing creates itself, whatever leads us to God. But our reality, I mean, even Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, to his students, what did he say to them on his day of his passing, on his deathbed? He said, "Halavai she'ela aleichem meirei shamayim k'meirei basar v'dam." Halavai should be, you should fear God as much as you fear other human beings. This is not the 21st century. Talking about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, to the greatest Tanoim of the time, greatest scholars. Because the fact is, when God created the world, even the most refined and spiritual person, physical existence is the most obvious. You wake up in the morning, you feel you're hungry. You don't necessarily feel that your soul is hungry. So that's what, so even Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said this to students, and every one of us starts the Shulchan Aruch al Yevish mipnei maligim shavisi Hashem lenegdi samid. Why? Why is it Shulchan Aruch? You could say, what about all the people that are tzaddikim and so on? They care about maligim, those that laugh, because we live in a world, and all of us, in some ways, are affected by this world. I'm not speaking now about rabbeim and tzaddikim on that level. Let's talk about the rest of us. So how do you get from a consciousness that elokus eined movade, nothing but, and suddenly we're struggling to figure out if God exists, and if yes, how he fits into our lives, and dealing with a Yetzer Hara, and it's not just an obvious fact. I mean, obvious emotionally, 24/7, that God is standing right near you, or else we wouldn't be shaykh to do something wrong. How does that shift? Comes the Arizal, the Chiddush of the Tzimtzum, that God turned the whole existence inside out. It's like a glove in a hand. Till now, everybody knew the hand was the most important thing, and the glove was a superimposed thing. Suddenly turned it inside out. Now you think the glove is more important than the hand, or at least the glove is more tangible than the hand. Like the klippa, the shell became more important than the fruit inside, or at least ostensibly so. And our avodah is to now reveal that that's not the case. So that shift is a qualitative leap. That cannot happen through incremental steps of a little diminishment here, a little diminishment there. There you need some radical leap. What he's calling here, dilug, or shalei ba'adrage. It cannot come in a natural, just a smooth flow, light, a little less light, less light. It won't work that way. You need something to turn the whole consciousness into another reality, that we should see existence first and God second. To the point we could even make the mistake. We can make the mistake. To the point, like he says in Tanya, Perek Lamed Vav, chapter 36, the point, Aniva Afsi Eid, I and nothing else. It started on Eined Movade, God and nothing else. And to the point that now it's I and nothing else. And we see people that live that way, God forbid. How is it possible? So that is what the Tzimtzum does. It creates a radical shift, a quantum leap. That is, now, is it airtight? Obviously not. Because first of all, the Tzimtzum is B'Shvil Hagili. Secondly, the Kav is going to soon emerge. And it will reveal things. So it's not like an airtight. If it was airtight, God forbid, forget about it. There'd be no way back. But that's not airtight. And that's what's so vital to know. But to create space for another in a Eined Movade consciousness state, pre-Tzimtzum, Tzimtzum is the key element here. Okay. This is when the Rebbe cried. Some of you will be familiar with it. We have it in recording now. Tu B'Shvat, Tav Shalom Tes. And again on Shana Rabbah Mem Dalet, very similar. What did the Rebbe say then? crying like a child. The Rebbe was saying, the Mashal Chassidus, that a father hides, conceals himself from his child in order to elicit the ingenuity of the child to find the father. But the father did a good job. He hid himself well to the point that the child can't find him. So he gives up, the child gives up looking. Remember when the Rebbe said this, it was like, it was heart piercing. The Rebbe said, Sonntag gesucht, Sunday he looked, Montag gesucht, and Dienstag gesucht. So Monday he looked, the child is looking for his father. He says, how much can he look? And it is nicht schuldig, the child is not responsible. He didn't conceal his father. His father concealed himself so well. God knows how to conceal himself, unfortunately, or fortunately. But the child, what do you want from the child? How long can you look? But when the Rebbe said it, you could feel the whole emotional impact of the tzimtzum, because that's what the tzimtzum is, that God concealed his presence. The goal was not concealment. The goal was deeper revelation and a deeper connection than ever. But it could be misunderstood because the concealment is powerful. And unfortunately, look how powerful. It brought tremendous tzaras to this world. There'd been no Holocaust. There'd been all the suffering that we've had, individual or collective, would not be possible in a world pre-tzimtzum where godliness is the only thing that prevails, that dominates. So it's not the small matter here. We're talking about human suffering. We're talking about every challenge we have. God should heal everybody. Everyone should be well. But every challenge comes due to this concealment. So ultimately, Mashiach Geula is that the concealment will be eliminated through our Avodah. But we need something we need to do. I'm just spelling out what this means in real personal terms. So this is the key to it all. So the tzimtzum, that essentially allows for the space for another, essentially for his chalkus, like he said. First of all, the hiding of the bligvul, concealment of the bligvul, and the creation of the possibility for the structure. So he says, so this is b'derech dilug, shaloi ba'adrage. It's in a leap. It's not orderly. It's not a progression. And then he says the following: the inyan had siluk, this siluk, and siluk is, as I said, a strong word. It means to be removed, completely be removed. Shenasa edei tzimtzum, that was caused by the tzimtzum. Hu hacholol u'mokim ponei. That is the space. That is the empty space. Cholol mokim ponei. Cholol literally means a hole, but it means like a vacuum. And mokim ponei, an empty space. That's what the tzimtzum created, an empty space for the other consciousness, for another consciousness to emerge. Hine b'meila, hariya'ir hanimshach achakach. Once this leap took place and it created this space, b'meila, the light that comes afterwards, which is going to be the kav. Ima yesei the chazer v'hayir. Even though it's returning, it's not a new light. It's returning. It says chazer v'hayir. First he concealed everything, then he returned the light. The light returns. So this is the kav aval hu b'derech dilug, shalei ba'adraga klal. So even though the kav is going to be light and it's going to be a transmission, but it was preceded by a concealment. So the light is also b'derech dilug. Not just the concealment, even the light is also a leap. That does not, and it's not an orderly light. It's not just Eid Ein Sof Lifnei HaTzimtzum seeping into the consciousness post Tzimtzum. That, in a sense, that was like concealed, and now a new reality has emerged. That the Kav, as much as it's bringing Elikus into the picture, it's now Elikus in a world where Elam is Bepshittus. Now world existence is the most dominant consciousness. That's even the highest levels, as he says, the Kav, Chazer v'Hayir. Okay. One second. I'm going to stop here because next comes a long mashal. This is all again from Ayin Beis, page 940. A long mashal to explain this, an interesting mashal about walking and running. Essentially, what does dilug mean? What does a leap mean? So I would say now we'll stop here. So basically a third way down on page 86. Obviously, anybody has any questions or comments? And we'll continue with the mashal tomorrow.
When we say that